what's happening? I thought we were supposed to be out of this. We've done some incredible work, but we're still in the middle of a war. We are lucky because we've got War Times, okay, which is an organization that's been around for 10 years, an incredible grouping of activists who've been writing, okay, basically, who've been trying to really play a leading role in pushing out some of the major questions, okay, that need to be out there for many of us that we've got to start thinking about. Okay?
Militarism is the belief or the desire of a government or a people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and be prepared to use it aggressively to defend national interests. So underneath this belief in militarism is this particular kind of patriotism that says what is most important in the world is to protect the interests of our nation. And that I, as a person who lives in, say, the United States, am going to be kept safe and am going to be most likely to have the best possible life if my country is really strong in a military way. That's what's going to prevent me from being attacked by terrorists, and that's what's going to give me a good life. If you're going to accept this idea that the military and having a strong military is the way to go to have a safe, secure country, you're going to have to buy some assumptions that are kind of buried underneath that. So one assumption is that your most important membership is as a citizen of a particular country. I'm American. I'm from the United States. This is central to my identity. And not only that, I have to believe that the interests of the US government, at least in the way that it's acting out in the world, are the same thing as my interests. You know, people used to say, if it's good for General Motors, it's good for America. I have to believe if it's good for America, it's good for me. And this was kind of the promise that people were given after September 11th, when you saw all, especially African Americans and Latinos on television, being interviewed with their American flags saying, we are all Americans now. And what September 11th offered people in a way was, now you can be an American too, if you'll wave the flag. There are certain values that militarism has that are ideas about what makes a good human being. What are the good moral qualities that a person who lives in a nation that extends its presence for good in the world through the use of military power? What are the things that we have to think are important qualities we should have in ourselves? So one of them is obedience to authority. And, you know, we have this whole theory in the United States that we're incredibly individual and free. And that's true if freedom is the ability to choose from 100 different brands of deodorant when you go into the store. How does thinking about the beast that we are confronting, how does it help us to think of it as militarism? How does it give us a handle on understanding the problems that working people, poor people, people of color, people in the global south face? How does it help to call that problem militarism? What does that give us to think about? We've entered a time now when those of us who spent the last 10 years directly opposing U.S. direct involvement in 2 wars that we know about and a bunch of other ones, now it's a lot harder to frame what we're doing in those terms because the war has become less visible, not to everybody, but to a lot of people in this country. And I think that while a majority of folks now see the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars as mistakes, they're less likely to blame this whole idea of militarism as the idea that whatever the problem is, the solution is a military one. They're less likely to see that as a fundamental problem. But we can do some work to help people see that these things are connected. It's not just an accident that we decided to have these adventures in other countries.
So one of my questions is, so we talk about militarism, and militarism is really big and overwhelming and global, and it's both, you know, concrete material as well as on the level of ideology. And, you know, a question I have is, how do we talk about militarism in a way that makes it real, that makes it rooted in human stories, in a way that makes it directly relatable to real struggles, and in a way that makes us avoid demobilization in the face of something so big. And one of the things that I would like to do is to look at the kind of militarism that we're dealing with right here in the United States, right now, and how social movements are responding to that. So as many of us know, there's a public perception, both within U.S. society and within U.S. anti-war movements, that the wars are over, that we've moved beyond the period of war. Now, my perspective is that it is not actually the case that U.S. policymakers have learned from their mistakes and turned some new page in U.S. foreign policy, but rather we're facing an expanding web of empire and militarism in new forms, and many forms that politicians consider more politically viable. So, you have huge social movements opposing wars on the grounds that they're unjust, so then politicians say, like, oh, okay, people don't like seeing soldiers deployed, so we're going to have drones, we're going to have covert operations, we're going to expand the number of military bases through Africa, we're going to do all these things while still putting a nice sanitized image on top of it. We're also seeing both hard and soft power networks. So hard power being coercion and war and occupation, and then soft power being these ways that the U.S. gets control by having all of these sort of State Department-funded operations all over the world and hands and everything, and some nonprofits doing the work of the State Department for it, though not all of them, but definitely some, and we have to think in a really critical, nuanced way about that. Another question I have is, how is the GI resistance and anti-war veteran movement uniquely positioned to bring an anti-militarist lens to the amazing economic justice movements that are gaining steam? And I would argue that that part of the movement has a really important role to play, but it's helpful to really pull that apart a little bit. The other question I have is, as we organize veteran communities and lift up voices of resistance from within the military, how do we transform social discourse that says veterans are special and have this privilege? How do we transform that and not play into that, but rather transform it so that we're also talking about the experiences of people living under occupation, or people who are affected by the military because they live in a U.S.-based town, the Philippines. Like the communities that are directly affected by war and occupation are very broad, and we don't want to privilege veterans' experiences, but we also want to leverage what we can in our movements to draw attention to the injustices of militarism. I think it's really important for us to both speak to the pain and the healing that exists in our society and find a way to transform that and to use that as a basis for organizing. And part of the reason why it's so important is that for anyone who's done outreach to active duty service members is that that's actually a really common reference point for a lot of service members. So if you go to a military base and you say, like, hey, are you against the war? Folks might not be excited about talking to you, but if you say, like, hey, do you know anyone with PTSD? It's an issue that affects your life. Like, you would not believe the amount of response that you get. It's really powerful. And military communities are really important communities to be organizing. We live in the U.S. empire, and the U.S. military is comprised of people. And people can bring that empire and bring militarism to a screeching halt by withdrawing their consent. I guess I'll just close by saying that healing is just really important, and that we as a society are going to have to deal with the fact that we also need to heal. And there are people that need to heal because of the way the U.S. military has affected their lives, but then that same military also traumatizes and wounds the people within it, and the broader society. That trauma trickles out and spreads. So, with that.
Thank you.
Wow. So, I'm excited to add to this conversation in part because I feel like when I say that there is a war on Black and brown people in the United States of America, I
feel like people will get that here. People will be like, that's excessive, right? I think that there are obviously different scales and different fronts on which wars are fought, and I think by referring to war, I mean no disrespect in terms of the scale or the intensity, but I mean very literally that we're using very similar technologies. We're talking about the same technicians. We're talking about the same weaponry. We're talking about people being trained up the same way. And increasingly, we're seeing not just kind of occasional cooperation or legislative cooperation on the books, but day-to-day, just meshing more and more tightly the operations of the United States military in all its branches and the United States law enforcement in all of its branches. So in terms of the relationship of policing and the militarization of policing, I think we are seeing an increase in that. But I think it's also really important to know that in the United States, there's almost never been a formal police force, right? We're not talking about like posses and not the earliest police forces, which were essentially mostly slave-catching forces, right? But there's never been like a formal police force that hasn't had some military aspect to it. There's a switch that happens after the Cold War, in particular, around kind of the relationship between military practice and policing practice in the United States. The technicians and technologies and practices that were at play in the Cold War needed new venues. People needed to be able to sell their technology. People needed to be able to sell their services. And so a lot of people who follow policing have noted that kind of moment of the shift in the Cold War, redirected attention to the home front, and redirected the kinds of technologies and practices that were happening mostly in other places here in the United States as well. We started to see, in terms of how we describe things domestically, this shift into using the phrase prison industrial complex, and there's no accident, obviously, that we started moving from the reference point of military industrial complex to the prison industrial complex, because there are so many parallels, and I think as we move through, we do see also these specific incidences that again are meant to exceptionalize and meant to be these explosive moments to allow these kind of windows into doing policing in a different way, right? So the sniper in the Austin Bell Tower at the University of Texas, right, gets highlighted as like, oh, well, we need people who are highly skilled and ready to act in a moment's notice for when these exceptional things happen, right? And Los Angeles Police Department says, hey, we got something for that. We're going to call it the Special Weapons and Attack Team, right? And in a little PR issue, you're like, wait a second, you can't call this an attack team. So it became Special Weapons and Tactics, right? So SWAT actually was a different name, which I think is a much more apropos name for it. But that was the first SWAT team in the entire United States was Los Angeles PD. The other thing that I think is really important to note about that is that these exceptional moments get used as this kind of diffuser, right? So whereas special weapons and tactics teams were really meant to be these and they were militarized, right? I mean, they were trained as paramilitary officers in that regard. And the way in which that they were employed initially was, if there's some explosive situation that regular police can't deal with, we need people who are highly skilled because the public needs to be safe. Right? And so if you put something out into place and you say that it's exceptional and it is required, this really excessive response is required, and then it never gets retracted. So these days, not only is the proliferation of SWAT teams really excessive, they are used in routine policing. All day, every day, SWAT is called out. So, I read a story recently, it's an older story, about Orange County police saying, oh yeah, it's common practice, we pull people over, 2 cars, 4 to 6 cops, they jump out, they point their weapons, and that way they know we mean business. This is what policing is. I cannot say this enough. When we see people pulled out of their cars, when we see people intimidated and pushed up against walls and hollered at. When we see people shot in the back, this is not exceptional policing. This is what policing is.